Have you ever noticed how the most perfect, beautiful, cloudless bluebird skies usually mean the absolute worst day of fishing in your entire life? You know the exact feeling. Yesterday, the fish were jumping into the boat. Today, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. The wind shifted to the north, and it feels like every single walleye in the lake just vanished into thin air. You probably said the exact same thing your grandpa used to say. The cold front gave them lockjaw. But what if I told you that is a complete lie? What if I told you those trophy walleyes are still perfectly hungry, but your refusal to change your tactics is the real reason your live well is completely empty? Today, we are going to break down exactly what happens underwater when a cold front hits. I promise you, by the end of this video, you're going to realize you have been driving right past the biggest fish of your life just because the weather got a little tough. So, let me ask you right now before we get into it, what is your go-to excuse when the bite dies? Let me know in the comments because today, we are throwing all those excuses right out of the boat. This topic is absolutely crucial because a sudden change in weather is the #1 reason fishermen give up and go home early. For generations, we have had these old sayings hammered into our heads. Wind from the north, do not go forth. We have been conditioned to believe that when the barometric pressure spikes and the temperature plummets, the fish physically cannot eat. So what do? We do the exact same thing we did yesterday. We pull up to the exact same shallow weed bed. We throw the exact same brightly colored crankbait, and we sit there shivering in the cold for 4 hours before calling it quits. We do this year after year, decade after decade, because it is comfortable to blame Mother Nature instead of adapting our own strategy. The truth is, a 10-pound walleye needs to eat to survive, regardless of what the local weatherman says on the morning news. Understanding how weather shifts alter a fish's physical location and biological needs is the single biggest difference between a guy who catches fish consistently and a guy who just goes for a really expensive freezing cold boat ride. Picture this scenario. It is 6 in the morning and you are backing your boat down the ramp. Yesterday was overcast, a little warm, and you absolutely hammered the fish in about 5 feet of water. But overnight, a massive cold front pushed through. As you step out of your truck, the air is freezing, your breath looks like smoke, and the sky is a brilliant, blinding blue. There is not a single cloud to be seen anywhere. You motor out to your favorite spot, drop your lines, and wait. And you wait some more. 2 hours go by, and your rod tip has not even twitched. The silence on the water is almost mocking you. It is right at this moment that 90% of fishermen make their first fatal mistake. They assume the lake is broken. They assume the fish have entered some kind of temporary hibernation. But the reality is entirely different. Those fish did not evaporate, and their mouths are not glued shut. You are simply casting into a ghost town. The biological reality of a sudden temperature drop and a massive spike in barometric pressure is that it makes the shallow water extremely uncomfortable for a predator. They left that feeding flat hours ago, and you are sitting there waiting for a bus that is never going to come. Let us talk about the science of a cold front for just a minute, because it is important to understand what the walleye is physically feeling. When that high-pressure system rolls in, it affects the pressure inside the water column. Now, a walleye has a swim bladder, which acts like an internal balloon that helps them maintain their buoyancy. When the atmospheric pressure changes rapidly, it puts stress on that bladder. Imagine being on an airplane when it suddenly drops in altitude and your ears pop painfully. That is somewhat similar to what a fish experiences, though on a different biological level. Because of this sudden discomfort, the fish naturally want to seek out stability. And in any lake or river system, stability is always found in deeper water. The deep water is insulated from the chaotic weather changes happening on the surface. The temperature down there fluctuates much slower, and the water pressure feels more consistent to their bodies. So instead of hanging out in the chaotic, turbulent shallow zones, they retreat to the basement where things are calm and predictable. This biological drive is exactly why your shallow water tactics suddenly feel completely useless. There is another massive factor that pushes these fish away from your favorite spots, and it has to do with their eyes. Walleyes are famous for having incredibly sensitive vision. They are built to hunt in low-light conditions, dawn, dusk, and under heavy cloud cover. That is why they have that spooky, glassy look to their eyes. Now think about what happens after a cold front passes. The clouds are completely stripped away, and the sun beats down like a giant spotlight. In the clear, shallow water, that intense sunlight is actually physically painful for a walleye. It is like you waking up with a horrible hangover and someone shining a heavy-duty flashlight directly into your face. You would immediately run to the nearest dark room and pull the curtains shut. The walleye does the exact same thing. They flee the bright shallows and seek out darkness. That darkness can only be found by diving into much deeper water or by burying themselves into the absolute thickest, nastiest cover they can find. If you are casting into clear water that is only 6 feet deep on a bright bluebird day, you are literally fishing in the one place a walleye actively wants to avoid. So, we need to completely bust this myth of lockjaw. Fishermen love this word because it takes the blame off their shoulders. But let us compare a post-front walleye to a guy on a lazy Sunday afternoon. Let us say you just ate a huge meal on Saturday, and on Sunday, you're just resting on the couch watching football. Are you going to sprint out the front door and run 3 miles down the street to catch a chicken for dinner? Absolutely not. You are tired, you are comfortable, and you want to conserve energy. But if someone were to walk into your living room, carry a warm slice of pizza right up to the couch, and hold it 2 inches from your mouth, you would probably take a bite. That is exactly how a trophy walleye behaves during a high-pressure system. They are not chasing fast-moving prey. They will not chase a crankbait being burned through the water column. They are laying low, conserving their energy, waiting for the weather to stabilize. But if you can drop an easy, vulnerable meal directly onto their nose, their predatory instincts will completely take over, and they will eat it. Your job is no longer to intercept hunting fish. Your job is to deliver room service to resting fish. The biggest mistake you can make right now is relying on your old fishing journal from a week ago. I see guys do this all the time. You are sitting in the boat with your buddy, the wind is howling, it is freezing cold, and you say to him, "Well, we caught 5 big ones right by this stump yesterday. Let us just wait them out." Listen to me very carefully. Waiting them out during a severe cold front is the fastest way to ruin your weekend. You can soak a lively minnow next to that stump for 10 straight hours, and all you are going to get is a sunburn on your nose and frostbite on your toes. The fish are not coming back to that stump until the weather pattern changes again, which might take 3 or 4 days. You have to break the habit of falling in love with a GPS waypoint. A waypoint only marks where the fish were at a specific moment in time under specific conditions. It does not mean they signed a lease to live there permanently. You have to be willing to pick up your anchor, pull up the trolling motor, and completely change your location. If you are not catching fish within the first hour of a major weather shift, staying put is an act of stubbornness, not a good fishing strategy. Okay, so you finally accept that the shallow bite is dead and you decide to move. But where exactly did they go? To understand this, you need to think about how walleyes travel. When the pressure drops and they feel that urge to seek deeper water, they do not swim 3 miles across the lake to a completely new area. They are lazy. They want to expend the least amount of energy possible. So they make a vertical movement, not a massive horizontal one. They simply slide off the shallow feeding flat and drop straight down the nearest steep breakline. Think of it like taking the stairs down to the basement. You need to look at your contour map and find the sharpest drop-offs that are located immediately adjacent to the spots where you are catching them before the front hit. If they were feeding on a reef in 8 feet of water, look for the closest ledge that plunges down to 25 or 30 feet. They will use that steep wall like a highway, slipping down into the darker, more stable water to rest. This is where your electronics become your absolute best friend. You are no longer casting blindly. You are hunting along the edges of these underwater cliffs. Once they slide down that steep drop-off, a lot of the truly massive trophy-class females will head straight for the mud. Let us talk about the deep basin for a minute. For a lot of fishermen, looking at a map of a deep, featureless mud basin is incredibly boring. There are no rocks, there is no timber, there are no structural differences to cast at. It just looks like a giant, flat bathtub. But during a severe cold front, this boring mudflat becomes a sanctuary for giant walleyes. The soft bottom allows them to literally lay their bellies right into the mud. This helps them stabilize themselves. It keeps them incredibly well hidden from above, and the water temperature down there in the basin is incredibly consistent. They will scatter out across these massive flats, just hugging the bottom and waiting for the storm to fully pass. Fishing these areas requires a completely different mindset. You are not targeting a specific piece of structure anymore. You are targeting a depth zone. You have to be willing to drift or slowly troll over these seemingly empty areas, trusting that the big girls are down there, pinned to the floor, just waiting for a small, easy meal to come drifting by their faces. Fishing this deep mud requires an absolute mastery of your sonar equipment. When a walleye is resting hard on a soft bottom, they do not show up as those beautiful giant red arches on your fish finder that you see in all the marketing commercials. Because they are belly down in the mud, their sonar return gets blended into the return of the bottom itself. You have to stare at your screen very closely. You are looking for tiny little bumps, slight thickenings of the bottom line, or extremely faint color separations right where the water meets the mud. It takes a lot of patience and a lot of focus. I remember one morning, the air was bitterly cold, and my buddy wanted to go back to the dock because the screen looked completely empty. But right on the bottom edge, I kept seeing these tiny little yellow flares in 30 feet of water. I dropped a heavy jig straight down, popped it twice, and suddenly the rod bent completely in half with an 8-pound walleye. If you do not know how to read your electronics for bottom-hugging fish, you will drive right over the biggest school of trophies in the entire lake and swear that the body of water is completely devoid of life. Now, what if you are fishing a body of water that does not have a deep mud basin? What if you are on a shallow river system or a natural lake that maxes out at 15 feet deep? When the cold front hits and they cannot go deep, they have only one other option to find darkness and security, and that is extreme, nasty cover. We are talking about submerged timber that looks like a sunken forest, or dense, thick weed beds that have not died off from the cold yet. They will bury themselves so far into this junk that they are practically invisible. It is like they are pulling the safety blanket right up over their heads. Fishing this kind of cover is brutal. You are going to lose lures. You are going to get snagged constantly. It is frustrating, tedious work. You have to literally drop your bait right into the absolute worst tangles of wood you can find. Most anglers completely avoid these spots because they do not want to retie their line every 10 minutes. But when the sky is high and blue and the pressure is peaking, that tangled mess of branches is exactly where the biggest, smartest predator in the lake is hiding. You have to be willing to risk your tackle to get the reward. Let us shift gears and talk about exactly how you present your bait to these fish, because your fast-paced summer tactics are officially dead. When a walleye is in this resting, negative mood, they have zero interest in chasing down a meal. If you're throwing big, aggressively wobbling crankbaits with loud rattles and ripping them through the water column, You are actually scaring the fish away. You're being loud and obnoxious in their quiet zone. You need to drastically downsize your presentation. Think about it in human terms again. If you have an upset stomach, you do not want a massive steak dinner. You might just want a handful of crackers. You need to take off the 5-inch swim baits and tie on a tiny 2-inch plastic. You need to use a smaller minnow or just a half of a night crawler instead of the whole thing. A smaller, less intrusive meal is much easier for a sluggish fish to digest, and it is far less intimidating when it approaches them. By downsizing your profile, you are turning your bait from a loud, annoying threat into a tiny, helpless snack that requires absolutely zero effort for them to slurp up. One of my absolute favorite techniques for waking up a comatose cold front walleye is using a heavy jig, and I mean really pounding the bottom with it. Now this sounds counterintuitive after I just told you to be subtle, but hear me out. When you drop a heavy, compact piece of lead directly into the mud or sand and aggressively snap it up and let it crash back down, you create a very distinct disturbance. Every time that jig hits the bottom, it puffs up a little cloud of silt. To a resting walleye, this looks exactly like a wounded baitfish or a crawfish trying to quickly bury itself into the mud to hide. You are not trying to feed the fish with this technique. You are trying to annoy them into biting. It is called a reaction strike. Imagine someone poking you in the shoulder repeatedly while you are trying to take a nap. Eventually, you are going to lash out and slap their hand away out of pure frustration. That is exactly what the walleye does. They are sitting on the bottom, feeling lazy, and suddenly this little annoying thing keeps crashing into the mud right in front of their face. Eventually, their predatory instinct takes over and they absolutely smash it. If you prefer a more natural approach instead of the heavy jigging method, you need to employ the live bait rig, and you need to move at a snail's pace. I am talking about dragging a live minnow or a crawler harness so slowly that you feel like you're not even fishing anymore. This takes an incredible amount of mental discipline. Most anglers simply reel too fast. When the water is cold and the fish are shut down, speed is your absolute worst enemy. You want to barely creep your boat along with the trolling motor, keeping your bait within 1 inch of the bottom at all times. You want that minnow to just barely struggle along the rocks or the mud, looking like the easiest, most pathetic target in the world. A good rule of thumb that I always tell guys in my boat is this: if you think you are fishing slowly, you need to cut your speed in half. And once you have cut it in half, slow down just a little bit more. You have to give the fish plenty of time to look at the bait, evaluate it, and decide to open their mouth. If it zips by their head in 2 seconds, they will not even blink at it. Now, let us talk about a situation that drives every modern fisherman completely insane. You are using your forward-facing sonar, or your traditional 2D sonar. You are in 30 feet of water. You see a massive mark on the screen right below the boat. You know it is a trophy walleye. You drop your bait down, you watch your jig on the screen descend right to the fish, and absolutely nothing happens. The fish just sits there and stares at it. This is the ultimate cold front frustration. The mistake here is usually depth control. When a walleye is in a highly negative mood, their strike zone shrinks from 3 feet down to about 3 inches. If you are hovering your bait a foot above their head, they will completely ignore it because they do not want to swim up to get it. You have to drop that bait directly onto their nose. You literally need to bounce it lightly on the bottom, lifting it barely an inch or two into their direct line of sight. You have to put the food essentially inside their mouth before they will decide to bite. It requires incredibly steady hands and perfect boat control to keep that bait dancing in a space no larger than a coffee mug. There is a very specific window of opportunity during these brutal high-pressure systems that most guys completely miss because they have already given up and gone to the diner for a hot coffee. It is what I like to call the late afternoon warming trend. Even on the coldest, brightest days, the sun is still beating down on the surface of the lake for 8 solid hours. By 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the water temperature in certain areas might creep up by just 1 single degree. Now to a human, a 1 degree change is completely unnoticeable. But to a cold-blooded creature like a walleye, that tiny little bump in temperature can act like an alarm clock. It can briefly stimulate their metabolism just enough to trigger a very short, very intense feeding window. I have seen days where the lake is completely dead from sunrise until 4 in the afternoon. And suddenly, for 45 magical minutes, every fish in the area decides to eat at the exact same time. If you pack up and leave at 2 o'clock because you are tired and frustrated, you are missing the absolute best chance to salvage your entire day. Let me paint a picture of a real-life scenario that happens on the water every single fall. You and your buddy are freezing in the boat. You are fishing a shoreline break in about 12 feet of water because you caught a limit there 2 days ago. You are complaining about the wind. Your hands are numb and you are ready to call it quits. Right next to you, about 50 yards further out from the shore, another boat is quietly hovering over 25 feet of water. You watch in absolute disbelief as the guy in the back of the other boat sets the hook and slowly reels up an absolute giant, maybe a 10-pounder. The difference between you and him was not luck, and it was not a magic fishing lure. The difference was about 13 feet of depth and the willingness to adapt to the conditions. He recognized that the bright skies pushed the fish deeper, while you stubbornly stuck to yesterday's game plan. That one moment of watching someone else succeed right next to you should be the ultimate wake-up call. It proves that the fish did not vanish, they just moved out of your comfort zone. Another critical detail that gets completely overlooked during a cold front is color selection. Think about what happens to the water clarity after a big high-pressure system rolls through. The wind often settles down a bit by the second day, the sun is shining brightly, and all the suspended particles in the water drop to the bottom. The water gets incredibly crystal clear. Now imagine you are tying on a giant bright neon orange or fire tiger-colored lure in water that looks like tap water. To a highly pressured, easily spooked fish, that bright, unnatural color looks terrifying. It does not look like food. It looks like an alien invasion. When the water clears up and the fish are skittish, you absolutely must switch to natural, muted colors. We are talking about soft silvers, translucent whites, pumpkin seeds, and pale greens. You want your bait to blend in naturally with the environment, looking exactly like the local minnows or perch. Sometimes the best color is no color at all. Just a plain, unpainted lead jig head with a live minnow hooked through the lips is the most stealthy, natural presentation you can possibly put in front of a giant, cautious fish. We cannot talk about cold front fishing without discussing the absolute necessity of precise boat control. The period immediately following a front is usually accompanied by a brutal, howling wind. Trying to fish slowly and meticulously in deep water, while a 20-mile-per-hour wind is pushing your boat around, is incredibly difficult. If your boat is swinging wildly back and forth, your bait is getting dragged violently across the bottom, completely ruining that subtle, slow presentation we talked about earlier. You must use your trolling motor or a perfectly placed anchor to lock your boat down over the exact spot. If you find a pod of resting fish in 28 feet of water on a small ledge, being blown just 10 feet to the left means your bait is completely out of the strike zone. You might as well be fishing in a swimming pool. Mastering your spot lock feature or learning how to properly deploy dual anchors in heavy wind is the only way you are going to be able to hover that tiny jig right in front of the walleye's face for long enough to convince them to open their mouth. Let us talk about the psychology of the angler for a second, because fishing in post-frontal conditions is 80% a mental game. It is miserable out there. The wind is biting through your jacket, your fingers are stiff, your nose is running, and the fish are making you feel like an amateur. The urge to reel up, crank the big motor, and head back to a warm truck is incredibly powerful. But this is exactly what separates the top 10% of fishermen who consistently catch monsters from the 90% who only catch fish when it is easy. Mental toughness is a fishing technique just as much as tying a good knot. You have to embrace the grind. You have to tell yourself that the fish are down there, and you are going to solve the puzzle no matter how long it takes. When you finally get that subtle little tick on the end of your line, set the hook and feel the heavy head shakes of a massive trophy fish pulling drag. All that misery instantly disappears. You will completely forget about how cold your hands are. Pushing through the mental barrier of wanting to quit is often the only way to catch your absolute personal best. Before you even back the boat off the trailer on a cold front morning, you need to completely re-evaluate your lake map. Sit in the truck with the heater on for 5 extra minutes and look at your topographical charts. You need to identify what I call the fish highways. These are the transition zones that connect the shallow feeding flats to the deep water wintering holes. Look for the tightest group of contour lines you can find on the map. The closer those lines are together, the steeper the drop-off is underwater. These steep walls are the escape routes the fish take when the weather turns nasty. They will often pause on little shelves or inside corners along these steep drops to rest. Instead of driving aimlessly around the lake hoping to stumble upon a hungry fish, you need to specifically target these structural transition zones. By mathematically eliminating the massive, flat, shallow bays that you know the fish have evacuated, you narrow down your search grid significantly. You are using geography to predict exactly where the fish retreated to, which saves you hours of pointless casting into dead, empty water. So, let us put this entire puzzle together. The next time the weatherman stands in front of the green screen and predicts a massive drop in temperature and a giant high-pressure system, you should not be groaning in frustration. You should actually be smiling. Why? Because that brutal weather forecast acts as a giant filter. It is going to send all the amateur fishermen, all the pleasure boaters, and all the fair weather guys right back to the boat ramp. You are going to have the entire lake practically to yourself. You now know that the fish did not stop existing. They just shifted their location. You know to abandon the shallows, track them down the steep breaklines, and hunt them in the deep mud basins or the thickest cover. You know to downsize your bait, slow your presentation down to an absolute crawl, and force a reaction strike out of a lazy fish. If you apply these specific tactics and maintain your mental toughness through the cold wind, a post-front day can actually become one of the most rewarding fishing trips of your entire year. You are no longer hoping for a good bite. You are actively hunting them down where they live. The ultimate takeaway here is that fish are driven by biological needs, not by the excuses we fishermen make up to feel better about an empty live well. The cold front did not give the walleye lockjaw. It just forced them to relocate to an area where you were too stubborn to follow them. By understanding how high pressure pushes them deep, how bright sunlight forces them into the dark, and how to trigger strikes from resting fish, you completely change your approach to the sport. The moment you stop relying on yesterday's spots and start adapting to today's conditions is the exact moment you graduate from being a casual angler to a true walleye hunter. That giant trophy female is down there right now, bellied up in the mud, just waiting for you to drop a jig on her nose. Thank you so much for watching and braving the cold with us today. If this video changed the way you look at the bluebird sky, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share it with a fishing buddy who always wants to go home early. Now, I want to hear from you. What is the biggest fish you have ever pulled out of the depths during a brutal cold front? Drop your story in the comments below, and I will see you on the water.